Hello everyone and welcome to a new video on writing. I know this is not something that I normally go super deep into. I try to focus mostly on gameplay design, map design, and unit design, things like that. They're more, I don't want to say objective, but definitely more mechanically oriented than writing. However, I've been thinking about writing in ROM hacks quite a lot over the past few months. Kind of coming out of FEE3, I saw a lot of different hacks when I was helping run the event. And just seeing some of these newer hacks that are coming out and some of the challenges that we've seen in the community recently. It seems like every month there's something that offends someone. And so in this landscape, I thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about really the two offending areas of writing and how you can think about them to improve the overall quality of your work. And that's humor, being funny, haha man, and edge, or being dark or quote unquote mature. How do you handle these two different, seemingly disparate themes? Or not even necessarily themes, but how do you handle these types of topics or approach this style of writing in your Fire Emblem ROM hack and make them better? So let's talk a little bit about how we can handle these so that we're tasteful and that we consider the medium with which we're telling our story in order to best set things up for our audience so they enjoy your work. Because I totally get it where some creators might say, like, I want to create something that is more mature than what you see in vanilla Sacred Stones, or I want to try something that's more comically oriented. And that's a noble goal, but you need to consider the medium of storytelling and what you do to achieve that end goal. So let's talk a bit more about that. So what are our learning objectives today? One, I'm hoping that by the end of this video, you'll be able to write a more compelling story. I don't think, we're writing fan games for Fire Emblem. None of us are going to take the Nobel Peace Prize in FE8 hack ROMs, but I'm hoping that this will help you write a more compelling story. I think secondly, learn how to avoid upsetting your players when exploring darker themes. I'd say this also extends to, kind of humor and how you handle humor and avoiding taking them out of the narrative through your humor and having things kind of fit better to best articulate what you're trying to go for. And then lastly, market your project appropriately to prepare your audience. I think one thing that's really important with these types of projects, especially if you're going too far on either end of the spectrum, is that you set expectations accordingly, or maybe adjust your art style or music choices in order to best set up your audience to know what they're getting themselves into. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So disclaimer before we continue, my opinion may be bad. I don't want anyone to think that this is super, the only way to approach things. I know that I'm super biased about certain things. I know when it comes to Fire Emblem, I expect things to kind of be within the realm of what I would expect in a Fire Emblem game. Maybe I can stretch a little bit beyond that, but it has to be done tastefully, and it has to be done in a way that doesn't break the immersion or feel out of place. I definitely am more of a traditionalist in Fire Emblem. I like the medium for telling stories. I like the types of stories the medium tells. I think you can certainly get more creative with how you use the medium, but I also think that if you stretch too far outside of what players might expect from the medium, that it's going to cause issues. Like I would say for myself, when I wrote Vision Quest, I think most of the hack is stuff that you could expect in a Fire Emblem game. Perhaps some of the dialogue maybe was a bit more lighthearted. Some of the topics and descriptions of food felt a little out of place, but it wasn't so out there that it took you out of the narrative. Like you believed that these characters would say these things, and it didn't feel weird or immersion breaking or cheap. Similarly, some of the darker themes kind of were handled with more care. And so this is what I like in ROM hacks and what I think makes for the best ROM hack, because you're using a pre-existing medium to tell the story. And so, again, you might watch this video and say, Dan, you're totally off. And you might be right. My opinion may be bad. So I'm just going to lay that out here, that you might not like what I have to say. So I put this together because I think this kind of illustrates the point that I'm trying to make with humor and edge. And I think it's really on a scale, right? You can go, here's kind of like the middle ground here. This is like a pretty neutral like story. There's some humor, there's some dark themes, but neither are too overt. This is pretty like safe in vanilla range. Like there's definitely some humor in vanilla games, there's definitely some darker themes in vanilla games, but it's super subtle. Like it's very rarely you hear someone describe a Fire Emblem game as funny. I would argue that vanilla games are probably just like a little bit more here because there's not a ton of humor and there's like a little bit more darker themes, especially in games like Sacred Stones. But if you go too far on the edges here, so like if you're too humorous, right, the game's just gonna look like a big old meme. And this is like, very overt. Everything exists for the joke. The humor is kind of out of the realm of what's expected in the Fire Emblem universe. I don't want to give examples because I don't want to make myself wince, but you can imagine when a hack does something that is immersion breaking on the humor front and doesn't adequately set up the player, it's going to take you out. Similarly, if you're too edgy, like if you show very graphic acts on screen, maybe something that is, sexual in nature, or something that is just really dark and disturbing, and you're too direct about it, and it becomes too much of a focal point. And also, if it doesn't serve a real reason, and that's kind of like how I feel about like these extremes, is that you're going so far in this way because you want to achieve comedy or you want to be dark, versus how am I considering this in context of the story? And the key point here is that whether you're too far on this end of the spectrum or too far on this end of the spectrum, the output becomes the same in that it takes the player out of the work and it makes them feel, I guess, disoriented might be the way, or it takes them out of the narrative. Like if I'm reading a book about, 19th century America, and then all of a sudden it's like you see Abraham Lincoln say LOL, it's like, okay, like it takes me completely out of the narrative because that wouldn't happen. And so similarly, if I was reading a book about, if I was reading like a children's book and then all of a sudden like there was a very graphic, violent scene, that would also take me out of it. And so ultimately, if you're too edgy or too humorous, I don't even know if too humorous is the right word. If you're just leaning in too heavily on these like humor devices, you're going to take the player out of your narrative. And so you want to try and like stay within the midpoint. You don't want to extend too far out of the range because that means you're kind of straying too far from what I see as like the accepted medium of Fire Emblem. I think you could certainly skew a little bit darker and it a little bit more humorous. And I think this exists on a continuum, right? There's going to be some moments where your hack will probably get a little bit more dark. There's going to be moments where it gets a little bit more humorous, but you want to kind of stay grounded. You have the center of gravity here that you want to achieve, where it's this gentle balance of both, and you might stretch a little bit more one way or the other. I think for me with Vision Quest, I probably, maybe get up to like here in terms of humor and then like stretch back and maybe get to like here in terms of edge, and it's kind of this like continuum, and it's this comfy zone that doesn't stray too far outside the realm of what you would expect in vanilla. And I think that that's really important, at least for the type of project that you're trying to create. Now, there's obviously exceptions to this rule. I think the hero we deserve is like over here, but it establishes itself as being so delightfully silly and doesn't ever try to take itself seriously that it can afford to be really humorous. I think it's much harder to achieve that on the dark side of the scale because it's like, dude, why are you being so freaking dark? Like, what's the point? Like, the Heroes We Deserve is just very humorous, and it exists to be a humorous hack. It's very clearly stated that this is a parody hack. Some might call it a meme hack. I know Chair doesn't like that, but it exists in this humorous range, and it makes it very clear that it's humorous. This isn't like, here's my Fire Emblem 8 rebalance, and it has a bunch of memes in it. Like, that's going to be too much over here, right? It's about setting the expectation. So what should I avoid in general? Talked about this a little bit. On the humor side in general, too many pop culture references. I think this was a learning for me with Vision Quest. In the early builds, I definitely alluded to pop culture or made allusions to memes, and I think it made some people groan. And then kind of seeing reactions to it, I groaned, and I removed it pretty quickly. So you'd now read the script, and there's very few, if any, overt references to memes or pop culture. You generally don't want to do this in Fire Emblem. I mean, vanilla Fire Emblem really doesn't do this. It doesn't allude to popular culture. Maybe it alludes to its self-referential popular culture with like Shanty Pete and stuff like that, but that's like an in-universe thing, and it's played off well in the context of the world that it's in. You just want to avoid pop culture. You want to avoid memes. You want to avoid modern slang and stuff like that. Second, being too direct when showing dark content. I think one of the beauties of Sacred Stones is that it's a kid's game, but there's like a lot of really dark shit in it. I think Gast has a video on some of the darker, creepier things in Sacred Stones. I think Orson and his obsession with his dead wife, Monica, who gets reanimated, and there's a scene where, you know, she's talking, but it's like an animated corpse. You never actually see her corpse. She doesn't say much. She just says, darling, darling, darling. And it's spooky, but it's not really that direct. And as a kid, it kind of went over my head. It wasn't really until I unpacked the scene, I'm like, holy shit, this is dark. And I think if you're too direct in showing dark stuff like that, or draw too much attention to it to like shock the player, then it's going to take them out of the narrative. Like you want to establish the tone versus kind of just like hit them over the head with it. I think there's an important element there. Taking your player out of the narrative. I've said this a couple of times. You just don't want to distract them. You want them to feel immersed in the story and in your game. And if you go too far in the extremes, it's going to take them out of it because it doesn't fit within how they're interpreting the universe that they're observing in this game. And then lastly, using language and terms that are too modern or don't fit with what players expect of GBA FE. This one is stuff like, if you're going to use kind of modern language, I think modern cursing doesn't really have much of a place in Fire Emblem. I think my opinion on that has changed over time. I think you can make cursing work, but I don't think it's that great. And I'm sure you can think of some like really modern terms that we use, like saying things are cool. I don't think that really even makes sense. There's going to be some other terms that I would use, but I don't really like saying them on camera because I know these clips will be taken out of context. So just keep that in mind. Don't use language that's too modern or that doesn't fit. There's a reason why, you know, we like to say dastard and craven cur and blackheart and all these kinds of like medievally sounding insults, is because that's what you expected of Fire Emblem, because that's what vanilla does. So what are some tips to improve on our writing here? Work within the confines. What will make sense with how the FE narrative is presented? As a storytelling medium, Fire Emblem has some specific confines. Part of that is established by the 16 plus games that have been created by the series, and that presents specific confines. And with that, you recognize that, especially in GBA, you know, things are kind of colorful. You have only a few different ways to explain something, and that's like through moving units on a map to visually show something. You have 4 units on the screen at a time talking in dialogue. That's really it. You have scripted battles and like a few special effects. You don't have a ton to work with. And so what can you do with the technical limitations of Fire Emblem GBA ROM hacking that then fits the narrative? That piece is really key. Like you wouldn't have like a, I don't know, like a carjacking scene in Fire Emblem. It doesn't make any sense. It would be really hard to pull that off well, I think. Think about how vanilla tells its stories and how you can best illustrate that. Like I think Road to Ruin does this really well. I think some of the best eventing I've seen in a ROM hack is when Vance is really drunk, and you can tell that he's drunk because of how he's talking. It's just him on the screen talking to Thraben, who is this bishop, and he's really drunk in the inn, and you can tell that he's drunk because through the text he's slurring his words and he's kind of yelling, and then there's a scene immediately where he's talking to his father, and then the father disappears, and then it cuts out to the town square, and all these people are looking at him and commenting on that he's drunk, and he's like, oh, my dad's right there, and then the camera does this amazing pan up to show that nothing is there, and then back down to Vance, and then music plays, and it's like, da, da, da. And it's like, that's a really good way to use the medium that you have, or using the tools that you have to tell something compelling. Like, it's a really memorable scene. I think Bloodlines does this pretty well too, from what I remember of it. There's a lot of good storytelling just through the devices that are made available to the player through the GBA engine. And so think about what's going to make sense in context of what is available. Challenge yourself to work within confines and work within the restraints, because that's going to breed creativity. That's my thought on that. I've said this a couple times, but copy language from the base games, avoid modern curse words. Yeah, I think that's just a good idea in general. I think you want to avoid saying anything too graphic or anything that could be too potentially triggering, so keep those things in mind. Avoid spelling it out for the player. I think sometimes writers don't want to be subtle because they want the player to get it a certain way. It's like, did you get it? Did you get it? Do you get that this is happening? Am I clever? And I'm totally guilty of this too. I've definitely done this before. And I think all of us as writers like want to have the player like leaving with a specific impression. And I think it can be hard to fight that urge to spell it all out or to make something too clear, because we don't want it to be misinterpreted as something else. And I challenge you to avoid spelling it out. I challenge you to be subtle. I think subtlety in writing is really good. I think you need to be able to hint to things that can lead to the interpretation that you want, but I think also opening it up for other interpretations as well. I really like reading what people say about Vision Quest's narrative, because I always find that people have a different takeaway, specifically around like stuff like how Titus does what he does, or how Storch does what he does, and the interactions and how they're interpreted. I find it super interesting, and that's because when you're writing, maybe sometimes you want to make it really clear, like, this is good, this is bad, and this is kind of like my point. Other times, I think, and what you should be striving to do is like presenting the story as is and leaving it to the player to kind of establish their own feelings on it. Like, this is just like a conversation that people are having. How does that make you feel? And sometimes you want to be explicit in making them feel a certain way as a result of it, and that can be established by the tone or by what happens after or any other literary devices that you might have. But you want to avoid spelling it out. You want to leave things open to interpretation, because that creates discussion, and I think that gives a lot of life and legs to your work. And lastly, treat serious topics seriously. I think this goes without say, but like, if you're going to talk about, like, I don't know, something like sexual assault, treat it seriously. Don't play like the Sarah theme while you're talking about like a traumatic experience. Treat it seriously, guys. Treat it seriously. Don't make light of something that could be offensive to someone else or that could be harmful. Treat serious topics seriously, and consider, is this topic too serious for Fire Emblem GBA ROM hacking to even be alluding to softly? Consider that. Ask yourself that when you're writing and see, do I need to go here to make my point? Can I achieve what I'm trying to achieve narratively through some other means? Keep these things in mind, guys. So how do we achieve comedy? You may now laugh. So I think with humor, sometimes people just try and like bash you over the head with it, and it's like, here's where I'm going to make a joke. Here's where I'm going to make a joke. And it doesn't really work. And for me, I think finding humor is finding the right moment. Like, humor is about like saying something in an unexpected way, but it has to be natural. If it's too unnatural, it's going to just feel like, you know, the lol random humor of internet yore. So for me, when I think about being funny, it's about finding moments to build character relationships and show personality. Are there scenes where I can just have the characters on screen and one of them makes a quip that's contextually relevant to what they're saying? I think, you know, what players find funny is always going to be different, and some players might not find your humor that great, but at least like think about like humor in real life. Think about things that you say that are funny. Think about times where you laughed a lot when you were hanging out with your friends or family. And almost always it's going to be through some type of event or some type of shared conversation or experience where you're doing something and someone makes a comment based on what just happened, and it's contextually very funny. And that's how you have to write humor as well. You can't just like force a joke a certain way. You have to consider the context. And I find that humor is just generally best in Fire Emblem when like you have two characters kind of having a conversation about something that's relatively inconsequential. Because if it's too serious of a section of the story or too plot oriented, it might take away from that and come across as distracting. So find those moments where, okay, this would be a good moment for them to kind of be sitting around and shooting the shit, and now they're going to be humorous and show their personality a bit. Supports are great for this, in my opinion, too. The scene should be on a topic that the player won't see as too serious. Yeah, so like don't make light of serious topics. In the same, kind of alluding to what I said earlier, but also consider in story, is this a moment where a character might say something funny, or how is the character feeling, where they might be too sad or too angry or too concerned to even be thinking about something humorous. And maybe for some characters, maybe that's their personality, and that can be a good way to show that off too, but you just got to handle it delicately and, be open to feedback. And then keep it appropriate and within the confines of the narrative. I think, again, being too random, too out there, doing anything I said not to do earlier, is going to kind of take the player out of it, and you'll be okay. Being dark and edgy. Oh man, there's so much to say. Don't tell the player the dark thing. Allude to it softly. Again, Orson in FE8, it alludes to it pretty softly. There's a couple of other things throughout FE8 that are alluded to fairly softly. Every time a bandit captures a woman, any sort of assault is alluded to very, very softly. You don't need to do the dark thing on screen. You don't need to show it on screen. One, because Fire Emblem as a storytelling device doesn't really lend itself well to doing so, but you also don't need to do that to move your narrative forward or establish that these guys are bad. Like if you're like with bandits, for example, it's like, okay, the bandit wants to sexually assault this woman. You don't need to show the sexual, I guess, why are you making them do that, first off? And it's probably to establish them as a bad dude and to make the player want to beat them up. I think you don't need to go that far in showing that on screen to make the player hate the bandit. Think about your end goal with how you want the player to maybe feel about a specific character or a specific situation, and recognize that you don't need to be nearly as graphic as you think to get the outcome that you want. So something to consider. Like you can think like, man, this guy's really fucked up and I want to beat him up. You don't need to do nearly as dark of a thing as you think you might need to do to get there. And that kind of brings me to my next point. What is the narrative purpose of this edge or this darkness that you're alluding to in your hack? What is it accomplishing? How is it fitting into your narrative? Because you want to keep the player guessing, and the anticipation is scarier than knowing directly what is happening. I think if you think about good horror movies, the scariest parts are always the parts where you think something really bad's about to happen, and you're on the edge of your seat, and the music is really scary. And when you look on screen objectively, like nothing really that scary is happening. Maybe they're like moving through a mysterious dark forest and like the vibe is super spooky and you're on the edge of your seat trying to wait to see what happens. That anticipation, that setting, that tone, that's the dark part. The guy jumping out with like a sword or a knife or something and yelling, that part is kind of like the payoff from that, but the setup is what's most key. And so when you're being dark or being edgy, you almost want to be more like unsettling in a way and kind of keep things kind of in like this vague, mysterious sense, because your goal probably is to make the player feel a bit uncomfortable, but not like directly uncomfortable with like something really explicit. Like I think you can establish a lot more in like darkness and edge and tone through music, through what you're not saying, and things like that. You want to keep the player guessing a bit, and kind of keep them on their toes for when something bad might happen. And that's more of like horror writing, I think, than just like handling a mature theme, but it kind of goes back to alluding to things softly because it leaves things more open to interpretation. Like think of like any like slasher film or any horror movie that you might have watched. If there's no like running scenes or scenes where like the protagonists are hiding from like whatever's out to get them, and it's just like kill back to back, it loses. If it's like a highlight reel of every kill that the bad guy gets, it's not really very spooky. It's just very graphic. What makes it spooky is the setup. What makes it spooky is the anticipation and the tension that you feel as a result of the scene that you expect may follow, but you don't know exactly what it's going to look like. And I think in Fire Emblem, that's more or less the sweet spot. I'm sorry if I'm not articulating myself well on this. I'm still drinking my coffee. And lastly, shock value is cheap and won't win you support. Doing something to be shocking, I don't know. I don't think you need to do it. I think you can do plot twists. I think you can shock the player narratively, but I think you just don't want to like do something totally out there to shock the player. You don't want to like have like a children's book style narrative and then all of a sudden like someone screams bloody murder and like someone explodes. Like it doesn't make any sense. It's going to be shocking and it's going to take them out of the narrative because it's not what it's so far out of the realm of what they're expecting that it upsets them. At least that's how I would interpret that. But maybe I just have a different taste. So how do we put this all into practice? So I know I've been talking a lot for the past 26 minutes. Let's talk about actioning this. 1. Get people to proofread your script before you insert or before release. Always gut check yourself. We might not think things are as bad as other people might. We have our own experiences and biases. We have our own blind spots. Get other people to look at your stuff and kind of get their opinion on it, to just, if only to make sure that there's nothing in there that could offend someone. When you're writing, I find it's really helpful also to keep an outline of key points and then fill in the gaps. So if you know like your goal is to get from A to B, what happens in between that line? And that's where you can fill out the scenes where, okay, this would be a good scene to show this. This would be a good scene to be humorous. This would be a good scene to establish a bit of tension. This would be a good scene for like their first meeting. And then, you know, kind of working backwards to get to where you want to go. Writing with the end in mind, right? If you know what the ending looks like, it makes it a lot easier to find, okay, this would be a really good moment to foreshadow this spooky thing. Or this would be a good moment to show humor or allude to this recurring motif. Because I think this is the right moment. And if you know kind of where you want to go, it makes laying out the path much easier. And then lastly, think of the purpose of leveraging different elements to tell your story. Why does this need to be humorous? Why does this need to be dark? Why are we doing this a certain way? How is this going to enhance the narrative? How is it going to make the player feel and propel them to want to move forward and turn the page, go to the next chapter, continue progressing through your game? Think about the different elements and what you want that to do. And that's it. I hope this was helpful, guys. I know that this may be a little bit different than what I normally do, but I'm hoping that it's helpful. I think, ultimately, gameplay is the most important thing in a Fire Emblem ROM hack, but writing can really elevate the experience and add a ton of weight to what it is that's happening. Like if you're playing 20 maps and there's no story, there may not feel like there's a ton of stakes, even if the gameplay is really good. Writing adds stakes. And if you can get the player invested in your narrative, that's really key. And I would say that sometimes I'm willing to deal with a more mediocre game if the writing is interesting and I care about the characters. And I want to see the characters interact with the world and with each other. I will say though, if like the writing's really bad and I'm being offended by it, then I want nothing to do with it. You could have the best game in the world, but if people are like, oh, it's that meme hack that makes these jokes, or it's that hack that has this really graphic sex scene or whatever, it's like, I don't want to touch that. Even if the gameplay is fantastic, I don't want to touch it. So keep that in mind when you're writing your own stuff, and lay it out in the comments. I'm curious to hear what you think and what works for you. Maybe I'll make another video on more like tactical writing advice, but I wanted to touch on this topic on humor and edge and just handling these disparate topics appropriately in the context of Fire Emblem GBA ROM hacking. And so I wish you good luck and feel free to write a comment if you have any questions or if there's anything that you want to add to this topic. Thanks again, guys, and I'll see you next time.